Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I am one of the uh, Yale Career Panel Planning Committee members, and one of the couple of people who started this program in 2012 when we first thought we'd do two or three of them, and we've kept on going. I'm very, very pleased about today's panel because we happen to think this is very, very important. Uh, but before I do that, I just want to explain some of the technical logistics. So, those of you who are in the audience, obviously you see the three of us on the stage. And by the way, I apologize. I have a throat cold, so I don't always sound like this. Um, and what we're going to do is we're going to spend about 40 minutes or so, longer, depending upon the questions, answers, etc. But and we're going to go through a series of questions on this very important issue of how the art of effective self-assessment. Um, those of you in the audience, you obviously can hear us and see us. At the end, though, instead of doing a pure Q&A, but you can actually raise your hand and ask a question if you wish, and we'll try to take a. We're going to put everyone into effectively a virtual cocktail hour. And the way that'll work, and I will explain to you, is when we end this panel, uh, you're going to see on the screen an option to join a fluid space. When you click on join, you'll go into essentially an electronic cocktail hour, but without the cocktails. And your face will be in a round circle, and you can use the keypad, rather the arrow keys, to move up, down, left, right. And as you approach someone in that space, the closer you get, the louder their voice and the farther away you are. And so we won't restrict where you go. You can join this group or another. If you're trying to look for Kristin or trying to look for Steve Blum, all you have to do is look among the circles and see who they are. If you want to know the details, all you have to do is hover your mouse over their round image, and it'll actually tell you their name, title, and affiliation. And we're going to go for at least 30 minutes, but we'll go longer if people want. The whole idea is you can do two things. One is you can ask questions of Steve or Kristin or myself, uh, and the other is you can meet other people and hear what other people are saying, have a conversation, network, and hopefully you'll make a few friends as a result of this session. So that's basically it. And so I'd like to get started and say first, take a minute and before I introduce our co-panelists, and just say why it is that the three of us feel that self-assessment is such an important thing for you to do. Because these career panels, which we've done, I don't know, 65, 70 or whatever, they're useful, but they're only as useful as your knowledge of yourself. So you could get perfect information about what it's really like to be at a law firm or really like to be investment banker or whatever. But if you don't have a good handle on yourself, what you're good at, what you're not good at, uh, what your likes and dislikes are, it'd be virtually impossible for you to get a good match, even if you have really good information about the professions that you're looking at. The other word I would use is candid and honest, because you can do a self-assessment, but if you're not getting an honest assessment about yourself, you're going to be misled. And there's no one on this planet that I know of who can be objective about themselves. I've been told that repeatedly by friends of mine. And so it's very important that not only you do a good job of really looking at yourself candidly about what you're good at or not good at, but also get friends and people who know you, who you trust, who are willing to be candid with you and say, "Oh no, no, you think you liked X, you don't," or "You think you're good at X, you're not really good at X, but you're good at Y." Because the better armed you are about yourself in a candid and honest way, the more likely you're going to do a better job of matching yourself with a career or a set of careers, right? Uh, Before we start, though, I just want to go through a short list of what are some of the self assessment questions that we as panelists think you should at least include on your list. It's not a complete list. And the reason why we do that is it's rare that someone thinks of all the things that really you should assess. One, for example, is attention span. Now, you wouldn't think about that as a question to ask yourself, but if you have a very short attention span, believe me, being a professor is probably not a good idea because unless you can write a book in a week, you're not going to be happy, right? On the other hand, like in investment banking, if you have a long attention span, you can be in M&A or corporate finance. But if you don't, maybe sales and trading is a better place where you know you make decisions on investments every 30 seconds, right? So though that's an example of a self assessment that's really critical for matching with a career, yet probably 90% of people don't think of that question, right, when they do a self assessment. So let me just go through a short list. One, what level of income is important to you in terms of comfort, lifestyle, etc.? Two, what are your strengths in terms of physical, mental, and interpersonal skills? What are you good at versus not good at? Three, what are you not good at in terms of skills, analytical or otherwise? Uh, Fourth, I already mentioned, which is what's your attention span, short or long? Fifth, are you a team oriented person or do you prefer to work on your own? We all gone through that. And some people are team people, some people, aren't. Uh, Six, does it matter to you if you're working indoors or outdoors? Well, if you like to be outdoors a lot, maybe being a forest ranger is a lot better than being an office worker. Seven, are you an urban, rural, or other type of person? Eighth, do you have family or companionship goals or preferences that might impact your career choices? And are you willing to be flexible relative to a companion? So you're married to someone who are likely to only take an urban job. Well, then the two of you got to figure out how you're going to make it work if you're not that kind of person. Uh, and then next to last, do you have geographic preferences with regard to where you'd like to work? That's very important. And that is very common problem issue and very common problem when it comes to thinking about the needs of your companion. And last, do you want to work or live in just a few places, or you can tolerate being in a company or profession that requires moving to different locations periodically?
Peter, I'm just going to mention that in the chat, somebody asked a good question, which is, could we have a copy of that list?
Absolutely.
Maybe paste it in the chat or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll send it to everyone, either in the chat or we'll send it to everyone who registered. But that's just it's a short list, but it's, my guess is that you hadn't thought about everything on that list. But at a minimum, those are the ones that you want to ask yourself and get a friend to help you. And someone who's
Peter, I know we haven't started our dialogue yet and we haven't been introduced, but I'll just add one other anecdotal one, which is the compatibility of the job with your recreational or hobby interests. For example, I have a daughter who, by the way, on Friday will turn 40, and she works as a coder at All Trails, which is an outdoor hiking app. She loves hiking. So there's a psychic benefit to that too.
Yep. Of course, none of you know, but Steve Blum was an outstanding fencer at Yale. And he's trying to figure out now still what job would allow him to use his fencing skills. But I'll stop there. Now, what I'd like to do is have each of the three of us take a couple of minutes, say what they do, and why you're connected to this topic. Why do you feel you're connected to this topic? And the other is maybe anecdotally a little bit about where maybe in your own career, because all three of us have had careers, you had the opportunity to figure this out about self-assessment and maybe zig or zag at the time. So, Kristin, do you want to start out for no arbitrary reason other than that you're the first person I thought of?
Okay,
Tell us
sure.
what you
Thank
do
you.
and why you're connected to this topic, and maybe one example in your career where self-assessment helped you decide which way to go.
Definitely. Thank you, Peter, and happy to be here with Steve also. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristin McJunkins. I am currently the director, it's a very long title, of Advanced Degree Applications and STEM Career Advising in the Office of Career Strategy at Yale. And, a lot of what I do, it's in terms of the advanced degree applications part, is health professions advising, as well as other, graduate school advising. And then in our office, we're all career advisors as well. And I've worked, this is my fourth higher education institution that I've worked at. However, in terms of sharing an anecdote, my plan was not to be in higher education. I never even knew how people got jobs in higher education when I was in college. I was a business major with a human resources concentration. And at the time, my plan was to work in, an organization in human resources, probably more in the training and development side, and had done some internships and, took a lot of classes in that space. And when I was graduating college, the economy was terrible. And I moved back home, which was Rhode Island, and, was interviewing for some jobs, but a lot of companies weren't hiring. But during college, and I went to college outside of Philadelphia, I was a student manager in my college union and for 3 years. And my supervisor in the union was leaving because her husband had gotten a new job and they were moving. And she said, "You should apply for my job. It doesn't pay a lot, but they would pay for your master's degree and things like that. And you could stay for a few years and then kind of go on and do whatever the next thing was." And so I did, and have been in higher ed for over 30 years, but have held multiple different roles. And, and where the assessment pieces come in is, in my earlier career is very involved in facilities management and, campus events and student activities, which take on a lot of time and nights and weekends and those types of things. And as I've moved throughout my career, I, have gotten the opportunity to do more types of advising and, really enjoyed that space. And I had to assess for myself, because did I want to go, higher in education administration and be a dean or something like that. And, to the questions Peter was asking, I definitely asked myself a lot of these questions along the way. And I like the more, kind of tactile, immediate, even strategic planning, but that interaction that I get through events and working directly with students. And so, I've been very fortunate in my career. But I continue to do self-assessment and, and to Steve's point about thinking about outside activities, as life has changed and I've gotten interested in other things, making sure I can have that balance of doing my work, but then, engaging in other activities.
All right, great. Steve, you've had an interesting career,
Yeah.
right?
Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for being on the call. And I don't want to keep us long from answering some of the sort of fundamental questions about self-assessments. I'll start from today and work backwards quickly. What makes this very relevant to me today is that I live at Yale. I live with the students as a resident fellow, and I interact with graduates, students, and undergraduates ranging in age from 40 down to 18. And I'm constantly helping them navigate decisions about who they are. In addition to that, as you'll hear momentarily, my own career involved, in essence, 3 large pivots that required me to think about myself. So moving backwards from these 12 or 13 years at Yale, where I'm helping people make assessments of their careers and their choices, including alums, I spent 26 years at KPMG, mostly as a partner in corporate finance, and then 10 years in 2 different jobs as an investment banker, purely doing deals as opposed to sort of partly doing deals at KPMG. When I left KPMG, actually, I'm going to be candid with the group. I think eventually I would have not been at KPMG anyway. So I was sort of leaving because I finally had a boss that didn't quite work for me. And when I did, I had to think about who I was. And frankly, it took too long. We can come back to that perhaps later on. So I did not do a good self-assessment in the year 2000 when I made that move. But I learned, and we should all learn from those changes. And after working at a very small firm with a KPMG alum, whom I like very much, I went to a family-controlled investment bank, and that too required a really self-introspection on who I was. And then the biggest change of all, and then I'll stop, was realizing that although I had a good skill set in corporate finance, many of the kinds of things that Peter does, every day of his life, I wasn't passionate about it. And so after 36 years, I took what I consider to be my biggest career gamble, looked at myself and said, I love Yale. I bleed blue. I was, as Peter said, a varsity athlete, and I fenced for 10 years after Yale. I had kids who went to Yale. Let's see if I can do something in higher ed. And so that required a great deal of self-assessment too. So we'll talk about more of these things in depth, but Peter, it's your turn.
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief. So first of all, I will reveal that Steve Blum and I are classmates, and we both in Branford at the same time. And I got to tell you, he was a great guy. He still is a great guy, but he was a great guy then. And my career, so I went to Yale, then I went to NYU, got an accounting degree as Steve did. We were in the same program, worked for what is now called KPMG, but then went to Harvard Business School. And my career really separated in three categories. I spent a number of years at Bain & Company doing strategy consulting, and they'd only started like 3 years before I joined. Then I was in private equity with the Whitney family venture firm. And then I ran the chemical industry investment banking groups at three major firms before starting this investment banking boutique, Younger Partners. But the one story I really want to say is just what happened between my sophomore and junior years at Yale. I was pre-med, I was physics and calculus major, and I spent the summer at the Mayo Clinic as an intern, following two doctors around. And the basic of the story is at the end of the summer, the two doctors sat me down. They said, we thought we'd sit down and have lunch with you and give you some advice. I said, that's great. And they said, the good news is you would be a great doctor. I said, wow, that's really great. You're good with people, you're a problem solver, whatever. The bad news is you should not be a doctor. And I said, why? He said, because we've gotten to know you, and the amount of control that you feel you need over your life doesn't exist if you're a doctor. And they pointed to the pagers on their belts, which tells you how long ago it was. They said, I'm not in control of my life. How many of my kids' school plays have I been able to sit through all the way? So they said, so we don't think that you should be. And then I went through the process of figuring out what to do. But there's a great example where I would never have figured that out, right? About myself, right? And it took two doctors who I followed for a whole summer to say, we got to know you, and we know some aspect that you probably are not aware of, and we think that wouldn't make you an unhappy doctor. So that's the end of my story. So let's go through and let's see. Let's start out with a general question, which is, if you're going to do self-assessment, how should you go about it, and what's the best way to do a self-assessment that is effective, and what ones that may not work? And by the way, I just open up to everyone, so it doesn't matter what order, whoever wants to address that question, because you can do it. We feel you should do a self-assessment, but the worst thing about not doing self-assessment is doing a bad self-assessment, right? Any
Agreed,
comment?
Peter. I'm happy to hop in on that. And of course, embedded in your question about what's effective is what works and what doesn't work. So let me focus on four aspects of what I think work. One is something that involves reflection and honesty. And by that, I mean, take your time. At the moment, it may feel like you have to rush, but you really need to dive deeply into this process. And when you do, the honesty part of it, the reflection and honesty, the honesty part is figure out what excites you and what drains you. You'll be able to infer things from that. All of that is the first of four things that, to me, are part of what makes something work. The second thing is to use some structured methods. Notice I didn't say rigid thinking. I'm saying use some kind of structure to start that dialogue. It could be some derivative of SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, strengths. It could be ikigai, which is sort of what you love, what you're good at, and what people will pay for. There are many different ways, but have some structure to start it. The third ingredient of what works is to get feedback from other people, be they mentors, colleagues, friends, possibly family. What are your strengths and your blind spots? And finally, and then I'll step aside, the fourth ingredient to me of what works is experiment. That usually doesn't come first. It'll come a little later. That could be internships, job shadowing, informational interviews, side hustles, whatever it might be. So to me, those are four elements of what might work. We can come back to what doesn't work later.
And I would absolutely agree with all of those techniques. And, and I think something to add is, trying not to, because I think a lot of times we end up assessing and making changes in times of crisis. And it could be a really bad job, a really bad supervisor, oftentimes when things are bad is when we feel like we need to move on, and the grass isn't always greener. So, I like working with students on a regular basis. I'm always telling them, reflect at the end of every semester. So, picking a time period for you regularly, like you may love your job, things may be great. But I think doing that assessment, at least once a year, maybe every 6 months, again, however you do it, go hiking, go, something, journaling, jotting things down, and looking back over that over the course of, a period of time, because you might see incremental changes that you didn't even notice, but you want to start to notice those before you get to a time of crisis and then feeling like you're having to make a big decision. Because I think it's better to, morph and kind of change direction when you're in a good space. Certainly it can happen when you're not in a good space, but I think I remember, one of my job moves from Philadelphia to Baltimore, it wasn't because my job was bad. It was more like I was just craving a new experience, and I wasn't able, there just weren't opportunities where I was, but I never left on a bad, like a bad note. There was nothing wrong. I wanted to push myself because I had never just kind of picked up and moved somewhere where I didn't know anybody. And this opportunity came along, and, it didn't end up being the longest term job I've ever had, but the experience in and of itself and the learning has really set me up for the last, 20 years of my career. And, and so like that assessment piece, for myself, I think was really good.
Yeah, my response about what works or doesn't work is the following, which is, by the way, one of my observations, which I actually shared with Steve and Kristin before, was one of the pluses and the tragedies uh, of how all these Ivy League schools in general, choose applicants is people who have straight A's and have high test scores and whatever. The tyranny of that is it puts a lot of burden on the individual because they have too many choices, right? You know, and and Einstein didn't have to spend a whole lot of time thinking about what career he wanted to pursue because he wasn't very good at much except physics, right? But so that's the first thing, which is try to step away and sort of say, okay, all right, I am who I am. Uh, I got to sort this out. But the other is, both Warren Buffett and Steve Jobs were asked the same question, which is, how do you choose what you want to do? And both of them said the following: a strong preference to do what you love. And it's really hard sometimes to sort through what you love versus what somebody told you or your parents told you you ought to be doing, or what is the fad, right? Or what makes the most money, or whatever it is, right? But start out first by saying, are there things that I really love to do, right? Is it one? If you're lucky, it's one. If it's three, maybe you're lucky, but it's harder to choose. And then you can sort through, am I good at it? And does it fulfill the other needs as well? Income or geography or whatever it is. but you got to start out saying, what do you love? If you never get to that question, it's going to be hard to get to the right answer, right? So next question is, um, what are the ways, what are some of the tools available to try to get honest answers? And, I know, Christian, you've got various tools that your office has developed for self-assessment, et cetera. What are some of the tools or just techniques that the audience might want to adapt in order to go through a self-assessment successfully?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. So, I mean, there's so many out there. I mean, there's all kinds of assessment tools, and I think Peter made the point earlier. Sometimes you can um, get the answers you think you want. I mean, we can, I think we're all smart enough to, kind of do that. So that honesty piece comes into play. But in the last, couple of years, I just put the link in. Our office was working on this Design Your Career, and it's an online module, and it comes from principles out of Stanford that design thinking, and they have a whole school and they've had courses on this, but this is really geared for people at any stage in their life, and which is part of the reason why we did it this way, and again, to kind of come back and do that different assessment. And it goes through many of the points both Peter and Steve were making in terms of understanding your skills, what you like, what you don't like, prototyping, trying things out, having these informational conversations. And and there's different assessment, like exercises throughout, you know, one related to, I think what Steve was saying in terms of your energy, like how do you like to spend your time? What drains you? What excites you? And I think, when you're thinking about work, I mean, knowing those things, I've often joked, I've had the jobs people don't want to do, over the years. And, but they've been fun for me, whereas, sitting behind a closed door and not moving around and doing other things like that never interested me. So, I think that's for us, this is one tool I definitely use that, and I've gone through things, myself. One of the exercises in there is called Odyssey Plan. And, you kind of make 3 plans for yourself. One, what you're doing right now and what your trajectory would be. If that job went away, what would be kind of the most next expected trajectory? And then the third one, if money, time, resources were not an issue, what would you do? And kind of coming back to what Peter was saying, what do you love? What do you like to do? And then sometimes, is there ways to kind of cull those together? And when I did this exercise, for the first time several years ago, one of the things I really enjoyed doing is health advocacy. And, but in terms of training and changing my career, I was just not really in a place where I was prepared to do that. But I realized that I can do this in my outside life. And this wasn't something I thought about when I was 20, but, in the last 15 or so years, it's something I've really, got engaged with, in a personal space. And so, to think of it that way, that it doesn't have to be one way or the other.
Yeah. Steve, tools and methods that you would recommend to people?
Sure. I was just typing in the chat 6 books that would be interesting, and I'll finish that after I answer your question, Peter. And it may guide people towards, and each of those books, by the way, has a different focus. We can come back to that. But
By the way, I did answer the person's question, and I put in the list of the self-assessment.
Yes, I
think
saw
it's
that. That's
in the
great
chat
that you
back
have
there,
that
so
in there
people
for
know.
everybody.
Go ahead, Steve.
Wonderful. So, you're going to think I'm wed to the idea of 4 things for everything, but I do have 4 sort of bullet points in my head with respect to tools, if you will. In a way, these are methods. One is 360-degree feedback. We deal with people every day. They tend to be, in the Yale environment, it would be friends and professors and so forth, but it could also be supervisors at work. But it's, up, down, and sideways. And what do they truly think of us? Some of those discussions can be challenging, but they're super important. The second ingredient of sort of a tool, if you will, to get your bearings are the personality and skills tests. Things like Myers-Briggs come to mind. There's also something called DISC, D-I-S-C. I see Kristin nodding because I'm sure she lives that world day to day. But these are, it's really important with these tests that they simply be a starting point for a dialogue with yourself. It's a lightning rod. Something about it will surprise you, something won't, etc. The third ingredient sort of in this tools question is a life review. Now, this is not taking a snapshot of Peter Young or Kristin in the moment. This is a longitudinal look at your life. Where have you succeeded and not succeeded? I never made an Olympic team as a fencer. By the way, I'm twice divorced. By the way, I left jobs in different circumstances along the way. It's really important to learn from all of those elements of this path, which for me is multiple decades, and to be very honest about it. And then the fourth thing is mentor feedback. It's not quite the same as 360-degree feedback. It could be a peer mentor, could be slightly asymmetrical in terms of knowledge, but people who you truly view as mentors. So I'm adding that to what Kristin said and what Peter has said.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of tools out there. I think you have to choose wisely, though, and because some of them are very effective and some will lead you astray. I'll tell you one story, which is, at Harvard Business School, they have a big office that's just like Kristin's office, right? Which is trying to give career advice and so forth. And they had a whole battery of tests. And I remember that I went in one day and said, there's some tests will help me between my first and second year that help me figure out whether I'm heading the right direction in terms of my business career. And they gave me like 3 or 4 tests, one of which is you answer like 300 questions or something, and they correlate your answer with the answers that people in different professions, and they try to see where there's a high correlation. So about 2 weeks later, I get a call from, they say, we've got your results, and could you come in? We're going to show it to you. And I forget the name of it. Kristin, you know the name of this test, but it's a famous test. So they said, the good news is you have 98% correlation with 2 professions. I said, wow.
Oh, is it the strength
That's
test?
really interesting. I said, what? So I'm all set, right? I said, well, here's the bad news. You have 98% correlation with military officers and musicians. So that's when I said, well, now I got to figure out how I have a career that combines the 2. Of course, I laughed and I joked. I said, obviously, I should be a musician in the military band. And they laughed. They said, that's not very funny. But, but was it still a useful tool? I think some of them are. And I would encourage you to go out and seek those tools. And some are not quantitative, methods. Some are just old fashioned, talking to people, right? I think the other tool, though, is to talk to people. And they may not even be people who are friends. I'll give you an example. I mentor a lot of people, and 80% are not people I know at all. And I got a request for mentoring from a Yale student who was in investment banking and had been at 3 major investment banks in corporate finance, and was a B of A was his last one. And he says, I'm thinking of leaving investment banking. I'd like some advice. So we sat down over a cup of coffee, and I just asked him questions. I said, what is it that you love about the 3 jobs? What is it that you don't like? And finally, at the end, about 20 minutes later, I said, it appears you like the work. They said, well, yes, I love the work. It appears what you don't like about, he was at Morgan Stanley and then something, and then B of A, is all the politics, right? He said, that's right. So your problem is not that you're an investment banker because you love doing that. Your problem is you've worked at 3 large investment banks where politics are much greater than at a small or medium size. And like there was a thunder strike, he said, oh my God, I never realized that. I said, but I didn't know this guy. All I did was listen to him for 20 minutes. But what was obvious to me wasn't obvious to him. So really, the fact that I knew investment banking helped, but not that I knew him. Other than this, I kept asking questions. At the end of the day, he said, so the answer is, can I do investment banking where there's less politics? I said, that's right. Go to a smaller firm or a boutique, whatever. Doesn't mean there won't be politics, but there just won't be as much politics. And so we moved to investment banking boutique. So the tool is not just talking to people who know you, right? It's talking to people who are going to listen, ask the right questions, and have some background knowledge to give you some good advice. So that's another tool. I'm going to switch to another topic. You know, it used to be 20, 30 years ago, people would join a company, stay there 20, 30 years, get a gold watch, retire, right? And play golf or whatever, right? I guess now it's pickleball, right? But times have changed. And now, if you believe the data, it is very typical for people to have 2, 3 careers, not just different companies, but totally different careers, right? It's very common. And that doesn't mean they're unhappy, whatever. The world has changed in terms of how careers happen and so forth. So my question to my two panelists is, uh, how often does it make sense to reassess? And to what extent is this boundary now that says you don't always have to have the same career affect the question of how you self-assess yourself for career and career changes?
Yep, good question. I'll go first, and then Kristin can correct me or make it better. I think there are 3 triggers in my mind. This is going to sound overly clinical, but it should be no less than some time period. So if nothing disturbs the ocean that you're swimming in, I would still say every couple or 3 years, it's important to take that close look, that self-assessment. But the 2 things that would trigger it within that longer time period would be any major life change. And some of that will fool you because it might not be related to work. It may be moving from one city to another. It may be having a child. It could be a number of things that should trigger a self-assessment. So that's one. And then the other one is really knowing yourself well enough that you're feeling down, or you're feeling burned out, or there's just something different about how you feel about your relationship with work the way it is. So just to summarize again, major life changes and or the feeling that the energy isn't there that was there before. And if neither of those happens, then every so often, just because you really should be checking. I'll stop there.
I would definitely agree. Again, I think as a society, I mean, I say this to students all the time, that as students, they're always so busy that reflection really just isn't built in anymore. If it ever was, I'm not sure. But as a society too, I think, you know, the fast pace of everything, we're on overload. And then when we stop, I think we just crash. And it is hard to find the time to just kind of step back and, you know, authentically look at, you know, where things are we good? Are we not good? You know, and life changes, you know, I think are a big factor. I know, you know, when I moved from Baltimore to Connecticut, so again, my mom was actually still alive. She's since passed, but I knew I would come back to New England at some point. But I was, you know, still in my 30s when I moved up here. And, you know, it happened much faster, but the opportunity was there. And, you know, the opportunity at Yale came open, and it was just, you know, a job I knew I would really enjoy. And so I made the decision, you know, I made that assessment that did I want to stay somewhere else, just because I wasn't necessarily ready to come back. And, you know, again, life gives you lessons that you never expect. And, you know, and it turns out in many ways that was actually the best time for me to come here because of, you know, things that subsequently had happened in my personal or family life. And, you know, so I look back and grateful for that. But it was a tough decision, you know, and I remember I kept asking myself a lot of questions. Like I just hadn't spent enough time yet in Baltimore, but it was the right decision. And you know, and I think again, it's hard to do. It's scary to do, to, you know, have those conversations, you know, because we're afraid we're going to make the wrong decision. But you know, I think as my colleagues have said, you know, decisions are going to come, and, you know, and there's, just good ways, to go about it. And again, I always look at it as trying not to make a decision from a point of crisis if you don't have to.
Yeah. Well, Kristin, let's be honest. Baltimore, New Haven, Naples pizza. Come on, that was an easy decision, right? Right?
But I was close.
Now
I mean, it's close to DC. There was good music. There's a lot of things.
I'll make a
But the
point
beach, I did miss the beach, so it has
yeah,
been very nice being
I'll
back.
make a point that's different from my two colleagues here, and that is everyone changes over time. Your interests, your so forth change, but also your family situation. There's always there've been a couple of mentions about family situations change, but the reality is what might be a great profession or job for you at a certain point in time may change, not because your skills are changing, but your life has changed, right? Either income needs or your family situation, whatever. So there's not like a time period so every 3 years. Part of it is whether your needs have changed and so forth. And my own situation is a good example, which is having been at some major well-known firms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I married late and I had my son very late, but I was 42 and I was running the global chemical industry group at Lehman Brothers. And it suddenly occurred to me two things. One is, given how much travel at the rate I was going, the number of school plays and things that I would ever attend if my son was going to be small. The other is that there were a lot of things I wanted to do. And I said, you know something? I don't want to wait till I'm retired to do it. I want to do philanthropic community things that help people, uh, with their careers, et cetera. I don't want to wait until I'm, 65 to do this, right? I'd made enough money in investment banking at that stage, so I didn't have to worry so much about income. And so I started my own firm principally so that I had the freedom to spend time with nonprofits that otherwise I wouldn't, and go to my son's school plays. And that was the right. So there are two things. One is my life had changed, my needs had changed. My needs were different at 42 than they were at 25. But the other is my personal desires of where I wanted to have an impact on life changed. And that wasn't feasible at Lehman Brothers to do these nonprofit things in a meaningful way while still doing my job. So that's what triggered it. So again, the point being that at different points of time, the world changes, but you may change also what your needs are and so forth. And I also would make the point, which is illustrated by my own situation, is it's not an either or. In life, you have to look at yourself and say, do I have a capacity? Everyone has a bandwidth, right? Some people can do 5 things at a time, some people go one. But examine yourself and say, can I do more than one thing at a time, right? If so, you have at least the option of fulfilling different needs of your life at the same time, right? And the answer may be, I can only do one thing at a time, in which case, don't do that. But if you can do more, then you should consider that, because so much of these career things is do one thing at a time. But that isn't always the best thing for you personally. Any other comments about that, like particularly changes in your life? Steve, I know you changes in your life over time. You weren't the same when you were 22 as you were when you were 30 or 40, right?
The
I won't
only
go
the
any
only two
farther.
things
I won't
I
go
would
any
add there.
farther than 40, Steve.
Peter, it is amazing, Peter. You and I have known each other for well over a half century. That's a ridiculous statistic. But there are two things that I would mention. One is, and again, it's important for all of us to be candid. I don't care that there's 20 or 30 people on this particular call and that other people will view it. Early in my career, I read my own press too much. And I had a fast track at KPMG. I became a partner fairly quickly. And I think that degraded some of the ways in which I viewed the rest of my career at KPMG. It's a longer story that I'm giving you a headline to. And the other thing is, Peter referenced it, and so did I. I self-identify even now at my age as an athlete. And as I get older, athletes are intensely aware of how their bodies and capabilities change. And I have had to deal with that. And that actually forces you to think about yourself. So longitudinally, those are two things. One was many decades ago, and the other is within the last 20 years. I've had to accept certain things about who I am.
So, Steve, have your fencing skills deteriorated?
Vastly.
But I got to tell the audience, if you've ever seen Steve Blum do a shish kebab, it's amazing.
Yeah, no, I take out most of my competitive yayas with tennis rackets and platform tennis
He
paddles.
could go right. He'd go
nowadays.
through that chunk of lamb and beef like it's butter. Kristin,
Peter, would it make sense for us to interact a little bit with the folks now?
no, we will. I don't know if there are any questions yet, but we're at the tail end of this last question. So I was thinking of just opening it up to the fluid space, but it's any thoughts of the panel here about whether to go give people the chance to ask questions through the chat box, or let's see if there are any.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody has questions,
Let's see if there are any.
put them in the box.
Any questions? Let's see if there are any questions here.
Peter, while you're looking, I will just add, since I know this, first of all, people are on, and secondly, it'll be recorded. One thing that we may not have gotten to one other step, which is with the work we talk about doing to know ourselves better, then there's a question of how do you actually use it? What is the way of doing it? I just wanted to mention, maybe some of this already has come up, but first of all, when you do learn what your strengths and values and passions are, mapping them against real job functions, so looking at X and Y and seeing where the intersection is, and then eliminating paths that clearly contradict who you are. And then the third element of that past mapping and eliminating is have some what I'll call informational interviews with people to test your hypothesis. Is this really true? And then I just had two more things to mention. One is use the findings from all of that to actually develop a plan. There's nothing embarrassing about having a Kristin McJunkins 5-year plan or 3-year plan for what the next few years of her life looks like. And then finally, this is a soft thing, but it's really important, is balance fit versus prestige. I went from a job and so did Peter, at hugely recognized firms to something different. Yale is recognized, but what I do at Yale, I'm 3 levels down from the people who run the university, but I couldn't be happier. So I chose something that has no optical prestige, but it's really the lane I should be traveling in.
Yeah, and actually, that's a good point. You made 2 good points, Steve. One, this issue of prestige, I want to expand that. It's not on the list that I sent to everyone in the chat box, but you have to decide how important it is to be able to have a lot of people recognize the name of the firm you're with. And I'll tell you a short story. There's somebody who wanted to join Young Partners, but his family was from India. And all his family members said, we've never heard of Young Partners. Okay, we know Young Partners is well known in the industries it serves, but we never heard of it. So he chose to go with a firm that's well known, ended up miserable because the trade-off between the job characteristic and the fact that he could go into a cocktail party and everyone would recognize the name of WeWork, it turned out to be a bad trade-off for him. And he admitted it later on. But you have to be honest with yourself and say, how important is it to be able to have the name recognition, right? And, of the firm you're working with or otherwise. I think a lot of that's drifted away because a lot of people now, Yale students are going to startups and so forth that no one's ever heard of. So maybe some of that's diminished,
Peter, I see a question from Patrice Bowman. If you,
I see that. I see that. But okay, so she said, how do you recommend if you're embarked on the career? I'm going from film into IT and coding. So I don't know how to answer that question. Steve, you pointed it out, so you can answer it.
Thanks a lot. Well, Patrice, clearly these are big changes. And I think it really points back to some of the things we already talked about. You almost have to do some foundational work about what kinds of people thrive in IT and coding. I happen to have 2 children and 1 spouse, all of whom are coders. So, there's this question about what does it take to really enjoy that versus being in the film industry, which I think right now must be under great pressure. So again, I would take it back to this intersection of 3 things that matter so much to me: passion, aptitude, need. What do I love? What do I do well? What do people need? And it's not always easy to discern those second and third ones.
Well, going back to
And
Steve's thing about what do you do with the self-assessment? The next thing is you got to match it with the right careers. And 90% of the Yale career panels have been focused on that, going back to 2012. We've done probably 65 different professions. We first thought we'd just do legal and investment banking and consulting, medical, but we've gone through every profession, whether it's drama and film or computer science or data analytics or AI or whatever. And all of these, they're 1 hour long and they're all recorded. So you could go to yalecareerpanels.com, either through the Yale website or directly, and it'll list all of the recordings of all of these sessions. And the focus of these panels is giving the audience a candid understanding of what it's really like or not like. But also, one of the questions is, what kind of person tends to do well and what kind of person doesn't? So the next step after you do a self-assessment, one of the next steps is to compare it to professions you're thinking about, but getting accurate information about those. And the reality is, vast majority of these professions have methodologies that are inaccurate. Law, if you watch all the TV shows on law, you solve you solve a legal question like every 15 minutes or between ads, right? Or whatever. So, or medicine. So the other is get an accurate assessment and but go to these recordings and they go back to 2012 and find the ones that match the one areas you're interested in and listen to what these people say.
And
Kristin?
I would just add to, like what Patrice might be thinking about, or anybody might be thinking about, is, function and industry. So, certainly moving into IT and coding may seem like a big jump from film, but the industry of film most likely may have some space for IT and coders if that's an industry you like to be in. So, if that you like the skills of using IT and coding, or whatever skills that anybody is thinking of transferring to, thinking about the industry. And, and I think that speaks to, Peter's point about smaller industry versus larger industry. I'll often, tell people, like, everybody needs a lawyer, but, do you want to be a lawyer in a large firm, or do you want to be a lawyer for a nonprofit healthcare association? 2 very different industries, but, and so I think that can also, help feed someone's fire in terms of their enjoyment and satisfaction.
Yeah, and specific to the question about IT and coding, it's very straightforward. AI is affecting many professions. And it's having a big impact on computer science and coding. And at least the friends I know who have an opinion about this, who are in the field, they said it's a strange thing. It's going to demolish early stage, more primitive coding because that's what AI is good at. But it's going to increase opportunities for experienced coders because even coding generated by artificial intelligence is got problems. And so it's going to increase the need for, of course, how do you go from beginning coding to experienced coding is a good question. But there's an example where a trend in technology is going to radically change the computer science industry. Okay. But as Kristin said, it's also going to dramatically improve other professions like drug discovery, et cetera, where it's going to be extremely useful and going to expand jobs. So what I'm going to do now is this. We've now reached 55 minutes. And what we promised is we're going to move everyone into the fluid space. I'm going to take panelists to the backstage, and then they have memorized that they have to click on the white arrow at the top going left to go into the landing page. Those of you who are in the audience, you're just going to go into the landing page. And when you get to that, you're going to find a button in about 20 seconds that says join Fluid Space, and click on that. And we're going to see you in the Fluid Space and get a chance to chat further.